All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. It's good to be back in Wilmington. There's been a few month hiatus. I don't think I've been down here since September, so it's great to be back in town. I've got a lot of ground that I want to cover today, and as you can see, I've got a sort of a topic that we'd like to talk about, that I'd love to talk about with you today. You know, what does it mean to be a writer in 2009? I think that was the big question that I had kind of going into the new year is, what does it really mean to be a writer in 2009? Our purpose for today, I wanted to discuss the status of publishing in 2009 with a specific focus on how writers are entering the profession. So most of us here are aspiring writers, myself very much included. So what does it mean today to be an aspiring writer? And how do we enter the profession of publishing? I think that was a sort of a central question that I had in mind as I was thinking about doing this discussion today. Certainly it has changed a lot in the past 10 years and definitely over the last 20 or 30 years. The way that writers are beginning to build their careers is very different than what it was when I first began pursuing this 15 years ago. So that was sort of the general idea that I wanted to focus on today. And then the point of this, I said, well, let me try and make a point here in this discussion. And I think the point of all this is that in today's publishing climate, which is very different than 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, authors really must be entrepreneurial. That's definitely a change that I have seen while I've been involved in the publishing business. Is that writers are becoming more and more entrepreneurial. And what I mean by that is that they're self-starters who don't wait to be found, but instead build communities and name recognition while developing their craft of writing. So it's almost like you have to wear two different hats. And most of you know this, but you really do have to wear sort of the hat of the person who gets out and does events, who helps out in their community, who perhaps has a TV show or a radio show or a website. You have to wear that hat, and at the same time you really have to wear the hat of being a writer, somebody who sits down at the computer or at the word processor to actually write your story, you know, once or twice per week, every week, week in and week out. So that's sort of the general idea of what I wanted to talk about today. I did want to mention that I do have copies of Claws finally for sale up here, and I'll pass some of those around in a minute. Those will be for sale for $10 at the end of today's discussion. I also have a tip jar if you just want to throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar to help pay for gas to get down here from Raleigh. That would be helpful as well. What I'd like to do, though, first is this motivation activity. I'm convinced that what makes writers persevere is that they have a clear understanding of what their motivation is to write. And so what I thought would be kind of neat would be to actually start with a little writing activity today. As you can see, a brief 3 to 5 minute activity. So on your own, I want you to write out an explanation regarding your motivation to write and publish. There are 3 questions here that I have listed. Again, if you don't have a copy of the outline, just look on with somebody. There are 15 of these floating around, so just buddy up to somebody next to you and share. The 3 questions, though, are: what do you gain by writing your story? First question is, what do you gain by writing your story? Does everybody have something to write with? Does anybody need a pen, paper? Paper. Juliana, could you see if we could get some paper from back there? Maybe we could get that started for folks who don't have anything to write with.
I have some sheets here.
Have some extra paper? That'd be a big help. Thank you. Who needs a piece of paper, something to write with? Anybody else? I think we're good then, Juliana. Okay. This lady here in the middle, in the beautiful sweater, has some extra paper. Or do you?
Yeah. Does it?
She needs some paper.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's okay.
Okay, so the 3 questions again. What do you gain? What do you personally gain by writing your story? That's the first question. Hey, Paul. It's good to see you. Welcome. What do you gain by writing your story? And then the second question which kind of really pertains to this group, is why do you want to publish your story, which is a whole different thing, obviously, than just writing the story. Writing the story is one thing. Publishing it is another thing. And I think it's clear that you understand the difference in your reasoning and your motivation for wanting to do both of these, because at least in my world, it's two very different reasons. Kind of interrelated, but different. So what do you gain by writing your story first? And then secondly, why do you want to publish your story? And it may be that you don't want to publish it. It may be that you just want to write and you want help, writing the book. And then thirdly, what will your audience gain by reading your story? What will your audience gain by reading your story? So what I'd like to do is just spend 3 to 5 minutes trying to answer those questions. It may just be a sentence or two per question. What do you gain by writing your story? Why do you want to publish your story? And then what will your audience gain by reading your story? What are they going to get out of it? What is the purpose in their reading it? Maybe it's a self-help book. Maybe it's a book about how to train dogs. Maybe it's a novel that you really want to entertain them with. But what do you hope your audience will gain from reading your book? I think we have one chair up here in the middle. If anybody would like to sit down, there might be one or two others around. Sure you want to stand up? I have one open seat up here. So the 3 questions again: what do you gain by writing your story? Why do you want to publish your story? And what will your audience gain by reading your story? Let's work on that for just a few minutes. It's about 5 minutes past 1 or 2. Let's work on that until about 10 minutes past 2. And then we'll just kind of chat about these things together. Everybody got it? Got something to write with? It may just be a sentence or two to help you sort of collect your thoughts on this. Doesn't have to be a 2-page essay. While you're working on that, I'm going to get the sign-in sheet passed around. I have a sign-in sheet. If you would just put your name and email address, that way I can let you know about future events that we have upcoming here in 2009. Thank you. So again, the 3 questions: what do you personally gain by writing your story? What is it that you get out of writing your story? Why do you do it? And then, why do you want to publish your story? The second question. Third question: what will your audience gain by reading your story? What will your audience get out of it? So the total time that I'd like to shoot for today is about 60 minutes overall. So I'm going to try to keep this within 60 to 70 minutes overall, in case you start getting restless or have somewhere else you need to be. Just another minute or two on this. And while you're finishing up, I guess I could get these passed around. I have sample query letters, which we'll take a look at here in a few minutes, that I'd like to get started passed around so that we can take a look at these. Again, I only have 15 of these. I wasn't expecting such a large turnout, which it's great to have a large turnout. I love to see it, but maybe just take 1 or 2 per row, and that way you can share.
Do you have this on your website?
I don't, but I'd be happy to send it via email to anybody if you need a copy of it. Okay, just another minute or two on this. Again, what do you gain by writing your story? What do you personally gain by writing your story? And why do you want to publish your story? And then what will your audience gain by reading your story? Well, why don't I get us started off? I'll put myself in the spotlight first, or under the microscope as the case may be. But I would love to hear some of you guys as well, what your feedback is on this and what your motivation to write this is. Again, the purpose for doing this is I'm convinced, having done this now for 10, 15 years, that the people who stick to it have a very clear motivation for writing. And I think if you have a clear motivation for writing, if you know what your motivation is, and the more clear it is to you, the more likely you are to persevere with this when times are tough or when finding a publisher is difficult to do. So understanding your motivation is really critical. For me to answer this, I would say, what do you gain by writing your story? I think the biggest thing that I gain out of writing fiction is that I achieve a little bit more order and clarity in my life. This is just me personally. No answer is necessarily right or wrong. But through the course of working on a novel, over the course of a year, year and a half, 2 years, sometimes less than that, sometimes more than that, I think what ends up happening is I really keep sort of a central focus in my life. It helps me to organize my thoughts. It helps me to maintain a balance. It helps me to stay focused. Just in general. And so it kind of, I think for me, that's one of the big reasons why I write. I think when I first started writing fiction with the intent to publish, 15 years ago, my writing was very chaotic. My life at the time was very chaotic and disordered. And I think writing has kind of gone hand in hand over the past decade to hopefully bring about a little bit more stability and order and focus and clarity in my own life and a sense of harmony. And I think, really, the writing has played a central role in that. And that's why I'm still doing it 15 years later. I'm not getting rich doing this. It's not for the money. But I think that there is an internal craving or desire to do that, to continue writing. And if I don't do it, I'll get irritable. If I get too far away from a story, if I don't stay on it for a couple of weeks in a row, if I let 2 weeks go by and I haven't written on a novel, I'll begin to get a little bit depressed. And I'll know that I need to sit down and write. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. That's just my personal reason for writing. Now, why do you want to publish your story? That's a little bit harder one for me to answer. It may be hard for you to answer as well. I think I have some sort of altruistic idea underneath it all that people could potentially see that I've managed to build some order and clarity in my life through my writing. And I think that's there. I think I want to entertain as well. I like sort of being the center of attention, can you tell? So I like entertaining. And I think I've learned the craft of writing a good story. It's almost like a puzzle. And I think I like the idea of writing a good enough story that the people in the publishing business look at it and say, wow, this is really good character development, this is really good pacing. So I think part of why I want to publish is simply to have somebody put their stamp of approval on it and say, you really have done a good job. You've worked hard enough, you've learned the craft well enough that we at HarperCollins or Random House or Simon & Schuster would love to publish this book. So there's that aspect of it too. I think as I've gotten a little bit older, I've looked for reasons beyond myself though to kind of sustain what I do. So that's a big part of it. And then what will your audience gain by reading your story? Well, with a book like Claws, I hope to kind of inform them about mountain lions, cougars. The book is sort of a mountain lion version of Jaws. So I want to scare them. I want it to be suspenseful, but I want them to feel invested in the story as well. Since moving back to North Carolina a few years ago, back to my home state, I think I've begun focusing more on the people around me and the people that I knew growing up with as central to what I'm writing. And the books that I've worked on in the past year or two have really started focusing on that. So what will your audience gain by reading your story? Hopefully a sense of connectedness, I think. I'd love to hear some of your feedback, though. What do you gain by writing your story? Let's start with that one first. Christine.
What do I gain by writing my story? I wrote self-awareness, sheer pleasure in the art of writing, extreme focus and attention, meditation, and sense of purpose.
That's awesome.
And why do I want to publish my story? I wrote to share my story, make it public, to inspire people to write action. I cannot tell people, practice peace, but I can inspire them through sharing at a very experiential level how I came to a place of peace.
Sure.
Personally and in my community.
So the hope is that somebody reading your book might move to action to actually find that.
To write action in their own fields.
That's a great reason for writing. It's central.
Definitely. And then 3, what will my audience gain by reading my story? And I wrote, I feel that people need to hear my story for emotional reasons. They need to belong. My story is about where on earth do I belong? So the conclusion of the story, it's resolved. And there are so many places where people can identify with my story that I feel that for emotional reasons, they need to hear it. For spiritual reasons, which is awakening to spirit and the presence of spirit in our daily lives. And for global historical reasons, the 60s message, and it's relevant to all everywhere, from the 60s to nowadays, to establish,
Sure.
peace.
Very
for
good.
all of humankind.
Thanks for sharing. That's great. Somebody else.
I was interested in that you mentioned fiction, and
Yes.
my work is nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the first question was, why do you write? Well, it's to clarify thought. That in whatever genre.
Sure.
And then the second one, to publish it was because I think it's solid. It's actually a cross genre, which is like very difficult to find a publisher. It's a memoir, but it's in poetry form. So I'm sunk, but it's solid. I just feel that confident in it. And then the third reason is that we're connected by common threads, which is something that I hear, with all 3 of us, and that we're products of what came early on in our lives that help us deal with challenges that we face presently.
Sure. You learn what strengths you have by reflecting on what you've been through.
It's all important, if you really think about it, start writing about it, as insignificant or as your life may have been, it's not really. What came before is helpful to you now. But I think it's interesting that it crosses fiction, yours as well, and nonfiction,
Mine is, I forgot to say, mine is nonfiction because
Right.
it's a memoir.
I can tell.
I appreciate your self-effacing tone, but I wouldn't say that you're sunk. In this day and age, there are so many paths to publication, which we'll get to later in the discussion, that I would encourage everybody to follow their own voice and whatever form you feel comfortable writing in.
This is a departure.
That's the
for
best
me
form for you.
To have written it in this in poetry. Most of my work has been research-based and easily published for educational properties. So that was kind of like.
And like I said, we'll talk
challenge.
a little bit about different kinds of publishers, scholarly publishers, academic publishers, and so on. Janelle, please.
What do I gain by writing my story? It gives my thoughts a voice. Why do I want to publish it? I have insights and characters I want to share. And what will my audience gain by reading my stories? Entertainment. And it's a way to discuss children's self-image issues in a positive way.
Sure. That's great. Can you think of something that you've written that you've gone back and read? I'm going to kind of put you on the spot if that's okay. Where you said, okay, I learned something by actually writing this about myself.
I was, yes. I read to all of you the story about Ozzy, the awkward elephant.
Sure.
How he's too big to do, or he's perceived as being too big. As a child, I didn't have a weight problem. As an adult, I did. And, you know, it's always hard to be the person who's not asked to dance. It's always hard to be the single when everybody else is a couple. So I knew what Ozzy felt. And now that people are saying, embrace who you are, be who you are, give yourself permission to change, then that's helped me.
That's beautiful. Awesome. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Maybe one more here in the middle? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I write because there are places in my mind that I can't go in reality. So I like to visit those places, and I feel somewhat deprived when I don't have a chance to visit those places because of my daily tasks. And and why do I, what was the reason why? Want to publish? Well, I have one published book, self-published, and I was scared to death to have anybody actually read, you know, something that I wrote. But the first time someone came up to me and they said, "Oh my gosh, I read your book. I couldn't wait to get out of that cave." You know, and I said, okay, this is it. This is why I like to write. You know, they actually felt they were in there. They felt claustrophobic. They, you know, the water was coming in, you know, and they were just experiencing the whole thing again when they were talking about it. So I think that's why, and I think it's just it's exciting. It's a whole new field for me. My background is in nursing, so. You know,
That's awesome.
Is a wonderful experience.
That's got to be one of the most gratifying feelings is, you know, when you actually have somebody read your book and they're so into it that, you know, that they comment on it and, or they say, you know, I was so surprised by what this character did, or I was so in, you know, I was so into this scene in the cave and I just wondered how the character was going to get out or something. That's very affirming. I think that's affirming, like nothing else really, as writers. Well, very cool. Thank you very much for sharing. Again, think about these things as you go home today, as you're thinking about your writing in the next few weeks. Ask yourself, you know, why am I really doing this? What is my motivation to do this? What is my purpose for doing this? And I guarantee you, the more clear that purpose is, you know, the more sustenance you're going to have, the longer you're going to be able to sustain your project. I think for me, the writing that was most haphazard was when I wasn't clear about what my motivations were. And knock on wood, now that I kind of have a better sense of why I'm doing this, I think I feel a little bit more grounded, and hopefully it will continue forward and it'll propel me a little bit. So returning to the question of what does it mean to be a writer in 2009, again, that's the topic of today's discussion. This is a claim. I made a claim here. I said, I believe a writer is someone who is compelled to tell his or her story. Fiction, nonfiction, that doesn't matter, as long as you are compelled to write it. And everybody in this room knows what I'm talking about. You know that feeling of, okay, I need to sit down and write this scene. Whether it's nonfiction, whether it's fiction, whether it's poetry, if you really feel an urge inside of your mind to actually sit down and write, if you're compelled to write, well then, you know, by God, you're a writer. I think that's what it's all about. Again, this is my own opinion. This is my own claim. I wrote two other things too here. A writer is someone who writes his or her book, or writes on his or her book at least once per week. So again, this is my own view of what a writer is. I think somebody who works a little bit on your book, you might not have to write on it 9 hours every day, you know. Everybody has to find their own comfort zone, but in my estimation, somebody who's working on his or her book at least once a week and stays with it over the course of 6 months or a year, that's a writer. That's somebody I look at and say, okay, that's a writer. again, I'm convinced that understanding your motivation to write is critical to sustain your project and to persevere, and ultimately asking yourself, am I doing this for the right reasons? Sometimes anger is a good reason to write. I know there's a writer up in Raleigh, Alexandra Sokolov. She came down here and spoke up last year. She wrote her first novel largely because she was PO'd and she just wanted to write. She was ticked off at the frustration that she was facing in the movie business. Sometimes that's a fine reason to write. For me, anger is not the kind of fuel that I want to sustain me, though. I think that ultimately that'll burn out. But everybody has to find their right reason for writing a book. And that is as unique and varied as we are, I think. But if you believe that what you're doing is for the right reason, I think that's going to sustain you. It just makes sense to me. Secondly, I write here, a writer is someone who pursues publication. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the #1 New York Times best-selling book published by Random House. But as long as you're pursuing publication and are putting a foot forward to actually try and find publication, whether it's with a traditional publisher or whether it's self-publishing the book, to me, that's what it is to be a writer. Which leads to, I wanted to talk a little bit about the query letter that I passed around. How many folks actually have a copy of that? So a few of them did make it towards the back. I think to pursue publication, first you've got to decide whether you want to traditionally publish or whether you want to self-publish. And sometimes it's trial by error. You may try to find a traditional publisher, what I'm calling a so-called traditional publisher. That is a publisher that pays you in advance or pays you some money, who pays for the printing themselves, who distributes the book in some manner or form to bookstores or online retailers. That's a traditional publisher. Most of the books in this store are traditionally published. Also, though, there is the consideration of self-publishing. And in this day and age, I think it's absolutely essential to being a writer to understand that it's perfectly fine to self-publish. There shouldn't be a stigma over it anymore. And anybody who wants to self-publish should feel perfectly clear in their conscience about doing that. I do, when speaking to large groups like this, recommend starting with a traditional publisher, at least considering that, because they're going to pay you money. It is a very competitive business, though, and so just like trying to make it to the #1 spot on American Idol is extremely competitive, making it to becoming the New York Times best-selling author from a major publisher is extremely competitive too. But there are other ways to get your work out there. All that said, I recommend trying to start with a traditional publisher first. Are there questions about what a traditional publisher is?
Well, not what, but how.
Okay.
I mean, what do you actually do? If you had a piece that was either,
That's a great
not
question.
100%, but who, where, what, how do you do that?
That segues nicely into what I wanted to talk about. So the question was, if you couldn't hear it at the back, was how do you actually find a traditional publisher? What I recommend doing, there are an infinite number of ways to do it, but there are several standard ways of trying to find a traditional publisher. First, if you have your book completed, if it's fiction, well, I should make a distinction between fiction and nonfiction. If it's fiction, I'll address both of these. If it's fiction, you'll need to find a literary agent. It's virtually impossible to sell a fictional novel on your own to a publisher. I would say 99.9% of authors, debut authors who sell their novel to a major publisher like Random House, Simon & Schuster, Penguin Putnam, HarperCollins, 99.9% of those have a literary agent. There is a point, I would say a 0.1% that occasionally can't, for whatever reason, can't find an agent, but manages to sell his or her book on their own. But for the vast majority, you need a literary agent. So how do you find a literary agent? There are several standard ways, I think, to find a literary agent. First, you can look them up online. There's a great website, which I'll look up here and kind of hold this up so you can see it, called agentquery.com. If you're taking notes, it's all one word, agentquery.com. And I'll hold this up for you to see. The neat thing about agentquery.com, how many folks here are familiar with agentquery.com? Looks like about a third of us, maybe half. Is it's a free website. It doesn't cost a dime. And what agentquery.com basically is it's a directory of literary agents who work in the profession of publishing. On this website, agentquery.com, there's a search feature over here on the left that has a couple of drop-down menus. And under the drop-down menus, let's say we look under nonfiction. There's a nonfiction and a fiction drop-down menu. Under the nonfiction, there's adventure, true story, art, biography, business, celebrity, cookbooks, so on and so forth. There's about 20 different types of nonfiction books that they have listed here in the directory. If you were to search that, what it will do is it'll bring up all the literary agents who are interested in representing that kind of book. So if you're writing, let's say, a book on dating and relationships, we'll just click on that and then hit quick search. It will bring up the literary agents that represent that kind of work. The first one here is Jenny Bent at Trident Media Group. Her address is listed here. Her email address is listed here. And sometimes it'll even list a phone number. For agents that are looking for books like the one I just searched for, there's at least 60 listed in here because I see it goes through page 10 on here and there are 6 per page. So agentquery.com is a great place to start looking for a literary agent. Again, if you're publishing fiction or what I would classify as sort of creative nonfiction, you're pretty much going to need a literary agent if you're going to try to find a traditional publisher to publish your work. The best way to contact a literary agent, particularly when you're starting out, is a one-page query letter. Now, other ways that you can, other ways that you can meet literary agents as well are through writers' conferences. A few of you were at the North Carolina Writers' Conference back in the fall. They have another big conference coming up in the spring. Question?
Oh, I'm sorry. You said the one-page query letter. Would that be email? Would that work?
That's a great question.
Send it, mail, or
2 years ago, even a year ago, I probably would have said send out print letters. Now, I would say start with emails.
Really?
I think that that's changed in just the past year. At least my perception of it, my opinion on it has changed in just the past year. In fact, when I did my last major querying of agents about a year and a half ago, I sent out all print letters and put them in envelopes, put a stamp on the envelopes, put a self-addressed stamp envelope in the envelope, and sent them out. But as of this year, 2009, I'm beginning to make the transition to just email querying. And what I did using agentquery.com at the beginning of the month was, I've got this query letter which I passed around for this new novel, The Profiler's Wife. And what I've done is, as of 2009, what I'll do is just whenever I'm feeling the urge or need to query, when I'm getting a little down in the dumps and saying, okay, I need somebody to take a look at this work. I know it can be published. I'll look up the agents on here that represent thrillers and mystery. And then what I've started doing is starting at the very back and working my way forward. And I'll send out maybe 10 queries at a time, upwards of 15, just by going in, finding their email address, and then copying and pasting the letter into an email window, sending it out. With the letter that I passed out, some of you have seen it, so far this year, I've had probably around an 80% positive return rate from literary agents. And
electronic, Stacey, or?
And it's all electronic. I've only had one agent request the manuscript in print out of this query letter that I've sent out. I've probably had about 15 to 20 who have requested it via email. So I think what's happening is a lot of the grunt work, if you will, if you pardon the expression, that's being done before a book goes to print is all being done electronically. It saves on paper, it saves on time. When I sent out my first batch about 2 weeks ago, I sent out about 15 all at once. I had like 5 agents that afternoon request to see part of the manuscript. That kind of return rate is just, It's unheard of with a print letter, where you might wait 2 or 3 weeks to get a response, or 2 or 3 months to get a response. So to me, it's just so much easier. Yes, back here.
Stacey, do these responses bring back requests for money? In other words, pay up front for the agent's service?
No.
Generally?
No.
Okay.
And if an agent, that's a good question. If you didn't hear it in the back, if an agent asks for money, that's a sure sign that the agent is not selling enough manuscripts to actually make a living, and probably would be best avoided, I think, unless there's some just outstanding circumstance. But generally, if somebody is asking for money to read your work, unless it's an editor that you're specifically hiring to do that, then I would avoid that. Yeah. Yes.
With your query letter, do you send a copy of the piece, or?
No.
Yeah.
That's a good question. So the question was, with the query letter, do you send a copy of like the opening 10 pages or the opening chapter? I don't. I just sent the one-page query letter, and I copy and pasted that letter from Microsoft Word into my email window. And I'm serious, with 1 or 2 of these agents, they responded within minutes. I mean, they were online literally when I sent the email, and they said, okay, send me the first chapter of this. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to sell the novel. The book hasn't sold yet. I haven't gotten an agent yet. But the response rate to whatever I'm writing in that letter has been very positive so far. Yes, Robert.
When you go to Agent Query and you find agents, I assume you link over to their website, right?
Sure.
Don't the agents specify whether they prefer being contacted through email or through a paper letter? Or?
They do. In fact, it says that on Agent Query. If you didn't hear the question, the question was, you know, don't they specify? Don't these agents specify? Most of the agents on Agent Query, it'll actually say does not accept email queries or does accept email queries. I've only had one agent who got a little bit sort of snarky or snippy with me out of this last batch, and she just turned out to be kind of a crackpot, quite honestly. She said first, I'll tell you the story just because it's humorous. She said, first, you need to go to my website and read the details. So I was like, okay, well, I'll do that. You know, I should have done that a little bit sooner. So I went over to her website, and she had all these submission guidelines that were sort of odd and peculiar. Like your initials had to be a particular initial at a certain time of the month to submit work to her. And so I just emailed her back and I said, I'm assuming that this was a request for submission, so I'm including the opening 100 pages of the manuscript. If not, feel free to delete the email. I'm sure you're very busy, and move on to the next thing. And she responded to that and actually said, no, this wasn't a request. It was a request for you to go to my website and see if your initials came up this month. And so I just went ahead and clicked delete, and I had other things to move on to. So there's a point there, though, that I think is important. Not every agent is an agent you want to work with. I mean, and I'm sure she sold books. I looked at her website. She sold some books. So, you know, everybody has to find for themselves. That was obviously somebody who we just didn't fit, you know, and you could tell. So.
I have a question.
Yes.
The piece that I'm working on, it's about 30 pages long. It was for a creative nonfiction class at UNCW. And I mean, I had done some of the work, but you know, it was a workshop class, and I mean, I know I could expand it. So if I get I guess my question was, I mean, that is the kind of thing that I would say, here, this is what I have now, and you know what I've developed it to. But to me, I can expand each one of those. The limit of the paper for the class was 20 to 30 pages, so I had to keep it condensed, but I could easily. You know, that's the core of what I want to, and it's a creative nonfiction. That's
a really great question, and it's a tough question for me to answer specifically because you're getting into real specifics here. I'll answer it this way. I'll say this: if your writing is strong enough, an agent's going to see that, and they're going to say, "I want to rep you, and I want you to finish this book." Harper Lee famously sold To Kill a Mockingbird just on her sheer short stories. She got an advance for To Kill a Mockingbird without actually writing any of To Kill a Mockingbird. And the publisher basically said, we want you to write a book for us and we'll pay you for a year to do this. So that can happen. It's very rare. Your writing has got to be outstanding, and perhaps also if you could connect with an agent on some other sort of professional level, which is something I wanted to talk about a little later too, is finding other ways to kind of get your foot in the door and get to know a few literary agents. For example, there's a gal up in Smithfield who used to work at Oxford University Press. She was an editor there, an acquisitions editor, and she and I have gotten to be pretty good professional collaborators. She's come to a writing group, a critique group, and she actually said after this last critique group that she's thinking about going into agenting. Now that's somebody who I've gotten to know personally, and she likes what I'm doing. She likes the writing that I'm doing. She sees potential there. So somebody like that, if I said, hey, I've got 100 pages of this new novel, I think it's going to sell, she might be interested in seeing me develop the project. But that's that's an unusual circumstance. So generally you need to have the book done, particularly for creative nonfiction. If you were writing a textbook and you had some sort of professional ethos or credibility, that's a little bit different. Like my wife and I sold a textbook to Bedford St. Martin's based primarily on what we teach at North Carolina State. And we had very little written. We ended up selling it basically on a proposal and an outline, and largely our name and our reputation. And we're now writing the book. So, but that's unique because that book is about, it's about scholarly writing, about academic writing. Generally, for most of the folks in the room, most of us here, if you're writing creative nonfiction or fiction, you're going to need to have the manuscript done. Definitely for fiction. It's very rare, unless you're an established author already, that you could sell it on just a few chapters or an idea. These are great questions. So you've seen the query letter that I passed out. A couple of things to note on that. I'd be happy to send it via email to anybody. If you did not get a copy of it, feel free to shoot me an email afterwards. But a couple of things to note on this particular query letter. I start by first very clearly stating why I'm actually contacting the agent. This goes without saying. You need to say to the agent up front, I'm writing you because I've written blank and I'm seeking representation for it. So I would just be very clear in what your purpose is for contacting the agent. Secondly, you'll notice in that letter that the next two paragraphs really focus on the plot of the novel. It's primarily a synopsis, a very short synopsis of what happens in the book. And then I think the fourth paragraph, I don't have a copy of the letter right in front of me, but I think the fourth paragraph or so gets into more biographical information. And that's the area that has really, for me personally, has gotten a lot more enhanced in the past year or two, just because I've been pursuing this doggedly and have worked now for a publisher, have had some success with an online audiobook, stuff of that nature. And I suspect that a part of the positive responses so far has been a result of that. But it all comes together. It's all ultimately persuasive from beginning to end.
What did you call that paragraph, Stacey?
There's a paragraph that's sort of biographical. In fact, I think it even begins with a little bit about myself, colon.
Some publishers that I have contacted really don't want that information in their query letter.
Sure.
I mean, if
you want to be sparing about it.
That's been a problem with me with a couple.
That's a good point. You want to use your own judgment. I would recommend if you've got professional credentials, I would put that in there personally, because it enhances your ethos. It enhances your credibility. And think about people that are persuasive. If you have credentials and you're professional and people can see, oh, this person has worked with another publisher before, that probably means that he knows a little bit or she knows a little bit about publishing, then they're more likely to say, well, let me at least see the first 10 pages. What you don't want to do is you don't want to give, a 5-page, bio of yourself, which is fine for your website or something of that nature, but not in a query letter. You want to kind of hit the high points of what your credentials are. That's a good point, though. Other questions, concerns?
They're all kind of quirky, if you want to know the truth. I mean, some want the stuff in double space, and some want it in single, and some, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't even figure this stuff out.
Yeah, and it's enough to make you want to pull your hair out. But I'm serious. If you have a really solid, just one-page query letter, you know, there's going to be some crazies out there, like the woman with the initials thing. You know, there's going to be some people like that. But the vast majority of agents and editors are normal folks working in a job, just like any of us work in a job. And they just want to they want to fall in love. Most of them, that's what they want. They want to pick up a letter and go, how has this person not been published? I want to read this book. And then they actually want to read the book and be swept away. That's what they're looking for. And they're not, you know, weirdos sitting in some sort of, you know, weird cell, you know, with, you know, I mean, they're normal people who are just looking for good work. And this is a profession of getting books to bookstores. And that's what publishers do. And they're just looking for good work. Question in the back, Tom.
Yes, do you email as an attachment these query letters, or do you do it in the body of the email?
I put it in the body of the email. So I copy.
Straight, they don't
Yes.
have to click on this to get there.
Absolutely. And I would, that's a good point. I wouldn't include an attachment in the first contact. You think about yourself. When you get an attachment from somebody that you've never heard of, you're like, okay, delete more than likely. If
And
your
with
spam filter
viruses,
doesn't
a lot of
catch
people
it.
are not going to open those attachments.
So use common sense. You know, what do you respond positively to when somebody contacts you? Or when somebody's trying to sell you something? Think about what you've responded positively to. And try and strike that same sort of professional tone, you know, when you're trying to sell your own work. Yes?
What do you actually put in the subject line when you do an email or a query?
That's a good question. I just put query for Profiler's Wife, the Profiler's Wife for this particular book. You know, don't overthink this stuff. Keep it simple. What are you doing? You're sending them a query for the book. And again, agents are looking for new writers. They're looking for new material. That's how they make a living. So they want to find authors who are ready to publish. Yes?
They make that very clear on their websites. They give you their guidelines. They tell you, no, I haven't found an agent yet that wants an attachment. So all of that's spelled out. And they're all different, as you said.
Sure.
So you just have to read their website.
Yeah, and it goes, you know, it's a good advice. Read their websites, if all else fails. Again, with the email queries, it's so simple to do. If you just choose 10 on a Saturday afternoon, you know, instead of watching, you know, Best American Dance Theater or whatever, and say, okay, or while you're watching Best American Dance Theater, you actually click through it and do it, then, you know, you can look at their website very quickly and say, okay, this is somebody who looks sane that I'd like to send my work to, and so do it, and stay on it. Again, a writer is someone who pursues publication. Stacey's point number 2 here. I really do believe that. I think all of us need to be pursuing publication, and it may be that the vast majority of us are not necessarily ready to publish our book for a $300,000 advance from HarperCollins and go on a whirlwind tour of Saigon and, you know, the Southeast Asia to sell your book. Most of us are probably not there yet. So there are other alternatives to actually, yeah, or financially ready.
Always ready.
And that's one of the hardest things that I think I found personally, is to be honest with myself and say, okay, is this book really, is it ready to be published? Am I ready to be published? And it's a hard thing to look at yourself and say, it might not be there yet. This is probably not the book for HarperCollins or Random House or Simon & Schuster. And then sometimes you get stuck on the fence. You're like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And then you pull your hair out, and that's what being a writer is too, folks, I think.
It's kind of like being objective with your child, you know. It's kind of.
That's tough. It's pretty hard to do. So I mentioned 2 things here to contact agents. Send out query letters. Anybody in this room can do this. You could go home tonight, look up agent query, and send out 3 tonight. It'd be easy to do. Just a second. The second thing I say here is attend writers' conferences and meet agents. There are all kinds of writers' conferences around the country. If you're writing nonfiction, if you're writing science fiction, if you're writing horror fiction, if you're writing romance fiction, there are writers' organizations for that type of work all around the country. You just need to search a little bit online and find what professional organizations would be best suited to your writing, and then what are their conference schedules, when do they have a conference. And those professional conferences are where agents and editors in the business go. Oftentimes they'll speak on panels. You can hear them actually talk about what they are actually looking for and what they've repped before or sold before. Then thirdly, I mentioned this is new for 2009, build a platform to enable working with agents. And I say over here, let me give the example of this William Patterson University moderator gig. I guess this kind of goes back to the theme or the purpose of today's discussion, which is authors in 2009 really have to be entrepreneurial in addition to loving the craft of writing and telling a heck of a good story. I think you have to be able to turn the cat back around backwards and say, okay, now I'm going to be sort of the entrepreneur or the business-minded writer. And an example of what I've been doing to try and meet agents beyond just sending out query letters and going to writers' conferences, of course, I've got this TV show in Raleigh. It's a little public access TV show. And I've turned that into, as many of you know, an interview type TV show where I'll interview authors or I'll interview publishing professionals. Back in October up in Raleigh, I interviewed a literary agent from Charlotte, North Carolina, Sally Hill McMillan, as well as an executive editor at Algonquin Books, Chuck Adams. And so I've started doing things kind of like what I'm doing up here today, but having a couple of extra folks in the business to have them talk about what they're doing and what editors and agents are looking for. Now, that might, obviously that's not going to be for everyone, but the point is there's probably some sort of professional avenue or pathway beyond just sending out query letters and going to writers' conferences, though those things are sort of foundational. I think you need to be doing those things. But there might be some other angle, if you will, that you could use to get your foot in the door. As a result of doing a lot of these panel discussions and being on the TV show, I had a writer who I asked to be on a panel back in July of last year who teaches actually during the regular year, not during the summer, in New York. And she ended up asking me if I would come to New York to talk about a book that I was trying to get published to her students. And I said, well, I'd be happy to do that. How about if I actually had a literary agent and editor talk to these students in the it was like a publishing editing track program. And she was thrilled by the idea because that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to enter that profession. And so then what I did was I contacted a few of my acquaintances or associates that I knew who were literary agents that lived in New York and editors who I'd met and asked if they would be interested in speaking on a panel discussion at this university. After some trial and error and knocking my head against the wall, I actually got a literary agent and an editor at Random House to speak on this panel. So we did that in December. Now, because of the success of that, I've turned that into, knock on wood, it's going to be a semester event where every spring and every fall, at least in 2009, we're going to try to bring in publishing professionals. Well, naturally what that does is it gets me face time with an agent, with an editor. And the more you're doing that kind of thing, and it may be something completely different than that, but the point is, the more you try different angles out to meet editors and agents, the better. I really believe this. This is what I've begun to learn, is that working with an agent, it's like a business partner. And sending them a query letter is without a doubt, that's the best, least expensive way to first get your work in front of them and introduce yourself to an agent. But there are other things too that can build relationships, because that's what this is all about. It's relationship building. And the more people get to know your name or see you and they know your style, the more likely you'll be able to find the right person to work with professionally. It may be that not every editor is interested in, suspense thriller fiction. Certainly they aren't. So it's a matter of finding the ones who are and then seeing whether they even like my style and what I'm about. I think there was a question here in the middle, though, I wanted to get back to.
I go to a lot of the query websites that says, this is how to write a query letter, this is how not to write one. And a lot of them say it's really a bonus if you have personal information. So whenever I've been querying, I've been researching the person, going to this website, going to that website, reading their interviews, and it's so tedious. There's no way I can send off, 10 a week. But in your letter, you don't really have it, so do you think it's important?
That's a great question. Did everybody hear the question? So basically what she was kind of asking is, how personalized should your letter be, and does it need to be personalized? With The Profiler's Wife, I started with a few agents who had actually I'd gotten to know. I'd say less than 6 that I know, and this started last summer, in fact. And so that's where I started, because I've gotten to know a few people, and so of course that was very personalized. One of the agents is based out of Scotland, and we've gotten to be acquaintances, pretty good friends. And so I didn't use this letter at all for him. I just sent him an email and said, you know, Alan, you know, I've got the book done that we talked about a year and a half ago. I'd be happy to give you a formal proposal for it. So that was very personalized. After I kind of worked through those, and it wasn't the right fit for them, then I get to what is more of a generic type query letter. And what you don't want to have come off is you don't want to have sort of, you don't want it to be fake. You know, it might be good to say in your introduction, you know, I see that you represent, you know, Jane Smith and John Doe, and I'm a big fan of their work. And I'm contacting you because I believe my novel or creative nonfiction book is similar to their book. Flattery goes a long ways. You know, if you can say to them, I think you're an outstanding agent. Again, you want it to seem genuine, obviously, and not false. But yeah, I think it can help. Every little bit helps. It's all a matter, what we're really talking about here are the finer tuning aspects of what is most persuasive. And certainly acknowledging the agent and their background and experience goes a long ways. Yes?
You can kind of handle that. I think your question is, you don't, since all the agents are different, you don't want to have to come up with, say, 10.
Well, it's tedious to do all the research and read all the interviews and then try and come up with something that doesn't sound
Right.
too fake.
Right. But I mean, it's kind of like sending out resumes for job interviews, where the resume is the common material.
Sure.
It's the same resume for everybody, but the cover letter, maybe only 2 paragraphs, is corporate specific or job specific, the target. Even within the resume, the way I do it with a resume is I have, it's a 3-page resume, most of it is common material, but then in the first paragraph, I write a specific qualification summary for each job. And you can do the same thing when you're querying an agent. Most of the material is going to be common, but you can just have an introductory paragraph that's specific to that agent. But I suppose you're also wondering about all the research you have to do for each agent. It's probably not that. You'll probably find that it's not that much after you've done a few. You'll probably find that most of the requirements are quite common, but there might be some specific quirks for 1 or 2.
Sure. Again, everybody has a different style. And I think it's ultimately up to you. If your heart is saying, I don't want to spend all this time looking up all this stuff, then don't. Write a query letter that will knock their socks off without having to do that, and hopefully that'll work. Obviously with this letter, that's what I've been doing. And the response rate, at least in terms of wanting to see sample material so far, has been very positive. So there's a lot to be said for having a really good letter. But use your own judgment. You know, if there's a couple of agents that really stand out to you, why not mention some, you know, personal information about them in the letter? Yes, Lee.
I was just going to mention that the research can be helpful. What I've found is sometimes I'll hear about an agent and she's a great agency and likes certain kinds of things, but then when I get to the website and I look at what she's looking for and her submission requirements, I found out she says, I want this, this, and this, but not that, and my novel might fit into the that category. So it saves me the effort of writing to that person. So I'd rather send 10 that are reasonably well researched than 20 that aren't.
And everybody has their own style. I think that's smart. I mean, I think that if you know a little bit about the agent, it's going to serve you better in the long run. So that's great advice. I do want to keep this rolling, though, and I'll try to answer as many questions as we have, but I don't want people to start getting too restless here. We are at about 60 minutes. Maybe I'll push it to 75 minutes instead of 70. So the decision to traditionally publish or to self-publish is a huge question that each of us has to consider at some point. Usually what I recommend is trying to start traditionally publishing first, work your way down through literary agents. If you try 300 literary agents and they all say no, try a few editors. If they all say no, then self-publish the book. If you believe that, you know, family and friends and a few people would be interested in it, by all means. You're going to make a lot more money if that's your main reason for publishing and distribution, obviously, going through a traditional publisher. There are some self-publishers, though, that have really done interesting things. And I list a few of these here on this outline. CreateSpace is the one that I'm going with for clause. Let me get a few of these copies passed around. I've been using CreateSpace for this. It's a website, createspace.com. If you take a look and pass one along, you can see the quality of the book. Now, for previous books that I'd self-published, I had gone with lulu.com. So a few of you might be wondering why have I made the difference? Why have I made a change? CreateSpace for this book, the cost per unit of the book is over half of what Lulu is charging per book. So the economy of this is what sold me on it ultimately. And yet the process to actually self-publish the book is very similar in terms of uploading a PDF file and all that kinds of things. So there are some self-publishers out there like CreateSpace, Lulu.com, Publish America, iUniverse. Some of you have heard me talk about PatioBooks.com before, the online audiobook publisher. Quickly, let me give you a sample of my online audiobook just so those who haven't heard this before will get an idea of what I'm talking about here. There's a website called PatioBooks.com. Patio is spelled P-O-D-I-O, B-O-O-K-S, PatioBooks.com. And what Patio Books is doing is they're basically publishing online audiobooks. Again, pardon this for those who have heard this before, but basically they're publishing online audiobooks. And if you're fairly tech savvy, you can upload yourself reading your own book online. The kinds of numbers that I've been getting with Patio Books is really outstanding. It's amazing. I started publishing, self-publishing the Colorado Sequence through Patio Books last May, another one of my books. To date, I've had over 30,000, not 3,000, 30,000 downloads of this book. So much so that I'm mentioning it now in these query letters, and I've had a few of the agents very interested in wanting to know what's going on with this technology and how am I getting 30,000 people, although it's not 30,000 people, it's 30,000 downloads listening to the book. And so let me give you a...
It's probably 30,000 individuals, don't you think?
No, I don't think it's 30,000 individuals. And that's the thing that I ended up chatting with one of the agents on the phone about was exactly what that is and how the data that I get is, it just shows the actual number of downloads. So I have no way to know if it's...
Somebody's downloaded it once and then got signed off and come back on to listen again.
Is that downloading the whole book or chapters?
It's done, that's a great question. It's done episodically. So I do a chapter at a time, or maybe 2 chapters if they're short chapters. And I'll just play like the first minute or two of this is another of my books, the Colorado Sequence. So I've added like music to the background here. You know, and it's up to you to spruce it up as much as you want. It's basically a minute intro.
Audiobook here at PatioBooks.com. This audiobook presentation is narrated by Owen Daly. The print copy of the Colorado Sequence is copyrighted 2007, and this audiobook presentation is copyrighted 2008. Print copies of the Colorado Sequence are available through online retailers like Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble Online. To find out more about me or about the Colorado Sequence, please do visit my website, StaceyCochran.com. That's StaceyCochran.com. Thanks so much for listening to this introduction. And now, the Colorado Sequence, read by Owen Daly.
So this actor friend that I've got doing the actual narration is he's a friend that I've met up in Raleigh who's kind of an aspiring actor, and so he's doing the reading of this particular book. I'm doing all the sort of post-production stuff with the music and kind of uploading it.
Chapter 1, The Caribbean Island. Dr. Amy Levine's interview with the U.S. government took place 90 miles east of Miami, Florida. Man-O-War Cay, Great Abaco Island. The island was privately owned by a firm known as Nanotech, but no Nanotech employee had ever set foot on the island.
So you get a sample of that. Again, the website is PatioBooks.com.
Nanotech existed only on paper.
And again, what they're essentially doing is they're functioning as online audiobook self-publishers. So folks who are really into iTunes and are downloading these things to their iPods are listening to this. And the numbers are extraordinary because there's not many people doing this. The folks who facilitate this really are at the cutting edge of online media for books. So I'd check that out, podiobooks.com, if you're interested. Yes?
So you're doing this to kind of put yourself out there more than financially?
Yes.
Free.
Oh, this is free?
Yeah, this is not a big money-making revenue. Again, this is self-publishing after I'd gone through about 400 plus literary agents for this book. So I recommend starting at the top, starting with traditional publishers, literary agents, and working your way down. If you can't find a traditional publisher, then there are alternatives for self-publishing that are really quite extraordinary. Now, you're not going to get rich doing this, no, but
Do you have to pay?
no, there's no expense for that.
But this increases your presence.
Totally.
Having
Name
30,000
recognition,
is-
whatever.
It's remarkable, and that kind of leads into the next thing that I kind of wanted to mention here, and that is I believe writers must develop their storytelling skill by first self-publishing. Again, this is a claim. This is my opinion. In this day and age, I believe a lot of writers really do need to develop their skill by self-publishing first. And that's a hard one to swallow. A lot of you might say, well, my book's good enough. I can find a traditional publisher. That may be the case, and I encourage you to try and do that by all means. I'm trying to do it for every book I do. But at the same time, when that doesn't pan out, with the novels at least, what I've been doing is I'm learning how to do events, learning how to publicize myself online, learning how to build a readership through audiobooks,